Shuffling their feet when a drum starts laying that solid beat. Boy, I can't stand still no more. Everybody's dancing and jumping too while the music's rocking, nobody's blue. A funny little rhythm with a solid sound, a boogie and a jump we call the Birmingham Bounce.
The first professional show I went on was with a guy named Happy Wilson, and he hadn't actually organized a band yet, but he had some bookings. He had been to Hollywood and done some music and some pictures, you know, and he had booked some bookings with some theaters where that film was going to be played, and they put the billing out on the screen and on the stage, you know, the same person. Well, they booked me to go with them. And here I am. I think I was about 14, maybe might have been 15 years old. If it was, I had just turned 15. We were going to go from Birmingham to Atlanta and start playing this theater over there. And they pulled up in front of my house to pick me up. And of course, the automobiles in those days had trunks. The trunk of the automobile had a spring and had a release that you had to release to let down. Sometimes that release would slip and the trunk lid would fall down, you know. Well, we were loading the instruments in the car in front of my mother's house at that time, and I put a guitar in, and then I said, somebody hand me the banjo, and about that time the trunk lid fell and whacked me in the head, and I just pushed it back up, and I said, come on, hand me the banjo. And the guy started laughing and said, my God, his head is hard as a rock. So they started calling me Hardrock at that time. And on the stage that night, he introduced me as Hardrock, and that's a true story of how it became. By the way, I've told that story to everybody from Bing Crosby to you. It's been a common question.
We're gonna rock and roll while we dance all night.
I had a song called Birmingham Bounce that did very well. And the next recording I had was this, gonna rock and roll, gonna dance all night. And of course the phrase rock and roll had been around the South for a long, long time. In fact, it had been mentioned on a lot of records, but it had a rhythm or a rolling or a sexual connotation, one of the two, mostly sex in the South. So when I recorded that thing, the guy that had the record label, the little Bama label, wouldn't let me use gonna rock and roll. He made me call it gonna dance all night. Probably the first time recording was made which music was referred to as rock and roll. So as far as I know, that's the first one that ever used the phrase rock and roll in totally music connotation.
Ain't gonna tell you no story, and I ain't gonna tell you no lies.
Well, I don't know the day I first met Hank, but Hank was working at station WSFA in Montgomery, Alabama, when I went to work. He's about a year older than I was. And so, you know, I met him early on in my career. I don't know whether it was, as I say, 39 or 40, but it was one of those 2 years. And we kept bumping into each other from time to time. And that's the way we met, just through the fact that we were both in the music business. And, you know, I had a nice relationship with Hank. At one time, during a short period of time, I was doing the booking for the Happy Wilson's Golden River Boys, and I was going through the area near Montgomery, and I turned the radio on, in the car radio, and I heard Hank, and I thought, well, that's crazy. Hank's in Shreveport. But I kept listening, and sure enough, Hank was on the air. And I wasn't too far out of town, so I drove on down to downtown Montgomery, pulled my car up into the parking lot at the Jefferson Davis Hotel. I went up to see Hank, and sure enough, he was sitting there with just him and a guitar with this whole bunch of song stuff laying on the table, doing a radio show. And so we sat there and visited, I don't know, for 5 or 6 minutes, and then finally he started singing his theme song. I didn't know we were still on the air. And when we got through, I said, I'm glad we didn't have anything strange to say, because I had no idea we were still on the radio, you know. Anyway, he said, come on over to the house. It was around noon, by the way. Come on over to the house, and I'll get Mom to fix us up something to eat. So I went over there, And this was late 48. The reason I know that is because Audrey was very pregnant with Hank Williams Jr., who was born early part of 1949. Well, I went to the house, and I knew his mother. I'd already met them. I'd been to the house before. And she did. She fixed us up a chicken dinner for lunch, which is around 2 in the afternoon by then. And during our conversation, Hank says, "Why don't you start booking me?" And he says, "I tell you, I've been doing some thinking since you've been here. You know, I'd make a deal with you where you could be my band leader and book me and book the band. You could handle the business of getting us on the stage and backing me up. And he'd give me 15% for the booking thing, plus paying whatever the going rate was for musicians." I said, "Hank, you know, it's a tempting deal, and I'm interested. But in January, I've got to go to the infantry school in Fort Benning, Georgia, and re-qualify my commission. I'd been appointed a second lieutenant, but I hadn't had the educational background to go with. So I had to go to the infantry school to qualify to keep my commission." And he said, "How long will that take you?" And I told him 90 days, approximately 3 months. He said, "Well, I'll hold off getting me a manager, and you give me a call." And he gave me the phone number. Anyway, I did call him. When I got out of the infantry school, I called him in the phone booth in the PX there in Fort Benning. And I told him that, and I said, "Hank, I don't think I can take it." He said, "Why, man, I've been waiting on you." I said, "Well, Hank, I think I'd probably kill you." "What do you mean kill me?" He said, "We never had a cross word." I said, "Yeah, but that was because we were friends." I said, "If I was your manager and you start pulling those shenanigans about not showing up and all that stuff, when I got a hold of you, I'd kill you." So I didn't become his manager. There was a man on the radio in Birmingham who called himself the Texas Drifter. He was very famous. And I don't know why, but from the time I was about 6 years old, and the reason I can tie it to when I first started the grammar school, I was 6, listening to the Texas Drifter. And I was really enamored of the Texas Drifter, and I wanted a guitar. So for Christmas, my Santa Claus brought me a guitar, and that's when I started. I did meet the Texas Drifter, by the way. Buck Weaver, who worked for my dad, did at the Birmingham Gas Company in Birmingham, you know, a public service company, was a good friend of the Texas Drifter, so they took me down to meet him, and I met him at that time when I was probably 7 years old at that time. Years later, the first good guitar I got, which was also brought to me by Santa Claus when I was about 13, was arranged with the Gibson Company by the Texas Drifter. He endorsed that line of guitars. My first guitar, the good guitar, wasn't a Gibson because we couldn't afford that. Gibsons cost $50. But for $37.50 you could get a Kalamazoo, which was almost the same guitar, but it was called Kalamazoo instead of a Gibson. So I guess since about 6 years of age.
Well, there ain't no news like rhythm and blues. Look what it's done to me. Wow.